Welcome to a tale of love, betrayal, and resilience. In a world where trust can shatter in an instant, Mason finds himself grappling with the harsh reality of infidelity after a business trip reveals secrets hidden beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life. As he uncovers a web of deception involving his wife and his boss, Mason embarks on a journey that tests his strength and determination. Join us as we delve into the twists and turns of Mason's fight for justice and the unexpected alliances he forms along the way. Will he find closure, or will the shadows of betrayal continue to haunt him? If you enjoy stories filled with intrigue and emotional depth, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more captivating tales. After returning from a week-long business trip, he sensed a shift in the air at home. His wife, Molly, once lively and affectionate, seemed distant and preoccupied. Small things began to nag at him: late nights spent working, the sudden interest in her appearance, the secretive phone calls she took in hushed tones. Each clue felt like a piece of a puzzle he was reluctant to solve. Days turned into weeks, and Mason's unease grew. One evening, while cleaning out the attic, he stumbled upon an old box filled with mementos from their early days together. As he sifted through the items, a glint caught his eye: Molly's phone, forgotten and buzzing with notifications. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. What he saw sent chills down his spine. Messages from an unknown number spoke of secret meetings and promises made in the dark. Heart pounding, Mason felt a rush of anger and betrayal wash over him. Determined to find the truth, he hired a private investigator named Rick. Rick was a seasoned professional, known for his discretion and ability to uncover even the deepest secrets. Mason handed over Molly's schedule and a list of her friends, feeling a mix of hope and dread. While Mason was away on another business trip, Rick set to work. It wasn't long before he gathered enough evidence to reveal a tangled web of deception. Mason's worst fears were confirmed. Molly had not only been unfaithful but had engaged with multiple men, including Mason's boss Brad and his son. The revelation stung, filling Mason with a tumult of emotions: betrayal, anger, and a deep sense of loss. Upon returning home, Mason confronted Molly. Their conversation was a whirlwind of accusations, tears, and disbelief. Molly's initial shock soon morphed into defensiveness. "You wouldn't understand," she pleaded, but Mason's heart was made of stone. He had seen the evidence, and no amount of denial would change the truth. Feeling the weight of his shattered trust, Mason sought the counsel of a lawyer named Lydia. A sharp-witted woman with a knack for navigating the murky waters of family law, she listened intently as Mason poured out his heart. She not only guided him through the intricacies of divorce proceedings, but also proposed a more radical idea: pursuing legal action against Brad for emotional distress. "It's about standing up for yourself," Lydia encouraged. "You shouldn't let them walk away unscathed." With her support, Mason began to plan his next steps, drafting documents and gathering evidence. But he knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't want to descend into a pit of revenge that would consume him. Instead, he focused on reclaiming his life, channeling his anger into work and self-improvement. While the divorce proceedings unfolded, Mason kept his distance from Molly, who oscillated between regret and anger. It was as if they were playing a game of chess, each move calculated but ultimately leading to the same stalemate. Meanwhile, Rick continued his surveillance on Brad and his son, uncovering a series of unethical business practices that could be leveraged to bolster Mason's case. Months passed, and the legal battle raged on, becoming a public spectacle. Brad, once a mentor to Mason, found himself in hot water as more of his misdeeds came to light. Mason felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. His pain was no longer silent. It was being addressed in court, and the truth was unraveling. In the midst of this turmoil, Mason rediscovered himself. He took up old hobbies, reconnected with friends, and began to forge a new identity. He realized that while Molly had chosen a path of deceit, he still had the power to redefine his life. Each day was a step toward healing, a way to reclaim the pieces of himself that had been lost in the chaos. As the final court date approached, Mason felt a blend of nerves and anticipation. He was ready to face Brad, ready to hold him accountable, but he also knew that this journey was ultimately about freeing himself from the shadows of betrayal. When the day arrived, the courtroom was filled with tension. Brad sat across from him, his demeanor a mix of arrogance and unease. Mason spoke eloquently, recounting the impact of the betrayal not just on his marriage but on his sense of self-worth. As he articulated his pain, the courtroom fell silent. In that moment, he realized that his story was not just about revenge, it was about reclaiming his life and moving forward. In the end, Mason's resolve paid off. He won the case, and while it didn't erase the hurt, it gave him a sense of closure. He walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter, the weight of betrayal lifting as he stepped into a new chapter. Mason learned that life would always have its challenges, but through resilience and courage he could rise above. With every step forward, he embraced the idea that sometimes the shadows of betrayal could lead to the brightest dawns. As Mason emerged from the courtroom, a mix of relief and uncertainty washed over him. The victory was sweet, but the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. He had finally reclaimed his narrative, but the echoes of betrayal lingered like a ghost. In the weeks following the trial, Mason focused on rebuilding his life. He started a new project at work, a chance to reinvent himself professionally and creatively. With Lydia's encouragement, he also began attending therapy, which helped him process his emotions and regain his sense of self-worth. During one of his sessions, he expressed a desire to explore new experiences, to shake off the dust of his old life. Inspired by this newfound energy, Mason took a leap and signed up for a weekend adventure retreat in the mountains. He was eager to push his boundaries and find solace in nature. When he arrived, the fresh air and stunning views invigorated him. He joined a group of like-minded individuals, all seeking personal growth in various forms. Among them was a woman named Clara, who had her own story of heartache and renewal. As they bonded over shared experiences, Mason found himself captivated by Clara's spirit. She was adventurous, passionate, and brought out a side of him he thought had vanished. Their connection deepened over the weekend, and for the first time in a long while, Mason felt hope stirring in his heart. However, back in the city, the shadows of his past began to stir once more. One evening, as Mason prepared for a dinner with Clara, he received an unexpected call from Rick. "I've got something you need to see," Rick said, urgency lacing his voice. Intrigued yet apprehensive, Mason agreed to meet him. When they gathered at a coffee shop, Rick laid out a dossier filled with new evidence. It appeared that Brad, cornered by his legal troubles, had started taking desperate measures. He was involved in a shady business deal with a known criminal organization, one that dealt in corporate sabotage and intimidation. "I think he might have put a target on your back," Rick warned. "He's not going down without a fight." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't anticipated that Brad would resort to such extremes. Suddenly, the notion of vengeance took on a darker tone. "What do we do?" Mason asked, his heart racing. Rick suggested they gather more information and monitor Brad's activities. As they delved deeper, Mason discovered that Brad's son, Jake, was involved too, caught in a web of his father's machinations. It became clear that the situation was more complex than he had thought, and his life was entwined with people who were willing to do anything to protect their interests. Despite the danger, Mason refused to back down. He decided to confront both Brad and Jake, not just to protect himself, but to ensure that he wouldn't be a pawn in their game. He wanted to take control of the narrative once and for all. As he prepared for the confrontation, Clara noticed Mason's change in demeanor. Concerned, she encouraged him to share what was troubling him. Trusting her, Mason revealed the depth of his situation. Clara listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "You're not alone in this. I can help," she said firmly. Together, they began to strategize, using her connections to gather intelligence on Brad and Jake's activities. In the days that followed, Mason and Clara became a formidable team. They tracked Brad's dealings and uncovered a plan that could potentially harm not only Mason, but many others involved in the company. The stakes were high, and Mason knew he had to act fast. One evening, they discovered that Brad was hosting a meeting with his associates at a secluded location. Mason felt a surge of adrenaline. This was their chance to expose him. With Clara by his side, he devised a plan to gather evidence and confront Brad once and for all. They arrived at the venue under the guise of catering staff, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The dimly lit room was filled with tension as Brad and his associates discussed their illicit plans. Mason's resolve hardened as he listened, knowing he was standing on the precipice of justice. As they moved quietly through the room, Clara signaled to Mason. She had spotted Jake. With a determined look, Mason approached him, cornering him away from the group. "You have to stop this," Mason urged. "Your father is taking this too far." Jake, torn between loyalty and fear, hesitated. "You don't understand. He is dangerous. If I don't go along with him, I'll be next." In that moment, a glimmer of understanding sparked between them. Mason knew that if he wanted to end this cycle of chaos, he needed Jake's help. Just then, they heard raised voices from the main room. The meeting had taken a turn, and tensions escalated. Without hesitation, Clara and Mason moved to the front. They burst into the room, revealing themselves to Brad and his associates. "Yeah," Mason declared, his voice steady. "I know everything you've been planning, and it ends now." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Brad. The shock on his face was palpable, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you can intimidate me?" He sneered. Flora stepped forward, holding up her phone, which displayed live footage of their meeting. "We have everything recorded, Brad. Your plans, your threats, everything. It's over." The room erupted into chaos. Brad's associates began to scatter, realizing they were in too deep. Jake, visibly shaken, stood beside Mason, signaling his defection. "You don't have to do this, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. As Brad faced the inevitable fallout, Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had stood up for himself and reclaimed his power. With Clara and Jake beside him, they watched as the walls of Brad's empire crumbled. The authorities would soon be involved, and this time, there would be no escape for him. Weeks later, as the dust settled, Mason reflected on the unexpected journey he had taken. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, but he had emerged stronger and more resilient. With Clara by his side, he began to envision a future built on trust, openness, and shared adventures. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset, Clara took Mason's hand. "You did it," she said softly. "You took control of your story." Mason smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "We did it together," he replied. And as they looked out at the horizon, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope, healing, and the promise of brighter days ahead. But just as they began to dream of the future, Mason received a text that made his heart race. A single message from an unknown number. "This isn't over." As Mason stared at the ominous message, his heart dropped. This isn't over. It felt like a haunting echo of his past, a reminder that the shadows of betrayal were not ready to release their grip on him. He quickly showed the message to Clara, who frowned, concern etching her features. "We need to take this seriously," she said. "It could be someone from Brad's circle, trying to intimidate you." Mason's thoughts raced. He couldn't let fear dictate his life any longer. Instead of retreating, he resolved to confront the threat head-on. With Clara's support, he decided to investigate who might be behind the message. They reached out to Rick, hoping he could help uncover the source. Rick sprang into action, digging into Brad's connections and anyone who might bear a grudge against Mason. Meanwhile, Mason and Clara began to notice unusual activities around their homes. Strange cars parked nearby, someone lurking in the shadows. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but Mason was determined not to be the prey. One evening, as they returned from a dinner date, Clara noticed a figure standing in the distance, half hidden by the trees. Mason's instincts kicked in. They decided to approach cautiously. As they drew closer, the figure emerged into the light, revealing Jake. His expression was one of urgency and fear. "Mason! Clara!" he exclaimed, glancing over his shoulder as if he were being pursued. "I need to talk to you now." "What's going on?" Mason asked, his heart racing. "I overheard my dad talking about you too," Jake said, breathless. "He's furious about the way things turned out. He's not just going to let go. He has plans to make your lives miserable." Mason felt the weight of dread settle in. "What kind of plans?" "Something involving the business, something illegal. If he can't control you, he'll try to ruin you through your work," Jake warned. "I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'm done with him." Mason saw the fear in Jake's eyes was a young man caught in a dangerous game, desperately seeking an escape. "You need to go to the authorities," Mason urged. "You have to tell them everything." Jake hesitated. "I can't. He'll know it was me. I'm not ready to go that far." Clara stepped in, her voice firm. "You can't let fear hold you back, Jake. This is your chance to break free." After a tense discussion, Jake finally agreed to gather evidence against his father. He had secretly recorded conversations and had access to incriminating documents that could bring Brad down. Mason and Clara promised to support him in this endeavor, knowing it was a risk for all of them. In the following weeks, they worked together, piecing together the puzzle of Brad's operations. They met discreetly, with Clara often acting as the lookout while Jake compiled information. As they delved deeper, Mason felt the tendrils of anxiety wrapping around him once again. It was a stark reminder of how closely intertwined their lives had become with betrayal, but he couldn't back down now. Finally, they gathered enough evidence to present to the authorities. With Rick's help, they arranged a meeting with a detective who specialized in corporate crimes. As they laid out the case, Mason felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were stepping into a dangerous territory, but it was a necessary step toward liberation. When the day of the meeting arrived, they met at a local diner where the detective, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Chen, listened intently. "This is serious," she said, reviewing the documents Jake had provided. "We can move quickly on this, but you need to stay vigilant. Brad won't take this lying down." After the meeting, as they walked to their cars, Mason felt a knot of tension in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just then, his phone buzzed again, a new message from the unknown number. "You think you've won? I'll make you regret this." Mason's resolve hardened. They had come too far to turn back now. With Clara and Jake by his side, they prepared for the storm that was sure to come. Weeks passed, and just as Mason began to feel a sense of security, the situation escalated. One evening, while Clara was at home preparing dinner, Mason received a frantic call from her. "Mason, someone's here. I think they're trying to break in." Panic surged through him as he raced home. When he arrived, he found Clara shaken but safe, having barricaded herself inside the bedroom. Mason swiftly checked the perimeter, but the intruder had fled. Clara's eyes were wide with fear, and Mason's heart sank. This was the price of standing up to Brad. The next day, Officer Chen called with alarming news. "We've gathered enough evidence to move on Brad, but he's aware that something's happening. He's become paranoid, and his actions are unpredictable. You need to be careful." Mason and Clara decided to go into hiding for a while, staying at a friend's cabin in the woods. They needed to regroup and strategize without the looming threat of Brad's retaliation. As they settled into the rustic setting, Mason felt a mix of calm and anxiety. This was a chance to reconnect with Clara away from the chaos. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara turned to Mason, her expression serious. "Do you think it's really over with Molly?" he asked. The question caught him off guard, but he appreciated her honesty. "I thought I had closed that chapter," Mason replied slowly, "but I realize now that trust is something I have to rebuild, not just with others, but with myself." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "You deserve to move forward without the shadows of the past. You've fought so hard for your freedom." As they talked, they began to discuss their hopes for the future. Mason found comfort in Clara's presence, realizing how much she had become a part of his life. Yet the question of trust lingered in the back of his mind. Could he ever truly let go of the past? Days turned into weeks, and during their time at the cabin, they found solace in each other's company. But just as they began to feel safe, a new threat emerged. One night, they heard a loud bang outside. Mason dashed to the window, and his heart sank. A truck, unmistakably Brad's, sat in the driveway, its headlights glaring through the darkness. "Get back!" Mason shouted as he rushed to protect Clara. They grabbed their belongings, hearts racing as they slipped out the back door. In the chaos, they could hear Brad's voice shouting for them. "Mason, I know you're here. You think you can hide? I'll find you." They sprinted through the woods, adrenaline pumping, the sounds of Brad's anger echoing behind them. They had to get to safety and fast. Eventually, they reached a nearby road where they flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man, agreed to take them to the nearest town. Once they were safe in a motel, they called Officer Chen, who assured them that they would take immediate action against Brad. "You've done the right thing by going into hiding. We'll have a team watch the cabin," she said. As they settled into the motel, Mason felt the tension begin to ease. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of betrayal weighed heavily on his heart. The changes in Molly had always haunted him, and now he couldn't help but wonder what she was up to. With dawn breaking, Mason decided to face the ghosts of his past. He texted Molly, keeping it short and straightforward. "We need to talk. Meet me at our old cafe." The meeting felt surreal, a juxtaposition of old memories and painful truths. When Molly arrived, she looked different, worn down and hollow. "Mason," she greeted, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "I've heard things," he said, cutting straight to the chase. "Things about you and Brad." Molly's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake, a way to escape the routine, the mundane." But it spiraled out of control. Mason felt a mix of anger and pity. "You don't get to play the victim here. You chose betrayal. You chose him." "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I could find something more, but it only led to pain. I miss you, Mason." He paused, grappling with the emotions swirling within him. "It's too late for us, Molly. You broke my trust, but I want you to be safe. Brad isn't going to let this go. You need to get away from him." Molly nodded, her facade crumbling. "I'll leave. I don't want this life anymore." As they spoke, Mason realized that while the past could not be changed, they each had the power to break free from its hold. He stood up, his decision clear. "I hope you find peace, but I can't help you anymore. I have to move forward." As he left the cafe, the weight of that conversation hung heavily on his heart, but he felt lighter than he had in months. The betrayal he had endured would not define him. Days turned into weeks, and Brad's empire began to crumble under the weight of the evidence they had collected. With Jake's cooperation, the authorities were able to arrest Brad, bringing his reign of intimidation to an end. Mason and Clara were finally able to breathe easy. They returned to their lives with renewed hope, ready to embrace the future together. The shadows of betrayal that had once loomed large began to fade, replaced by the light of new beginnings. As they sat together one evening, reflecting on their journey, Clara turned to Mason. What do you think the future holds for us? Mason smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. Whatever it is, I know we'll face it together. But just as they began to dream of what lay ahead, Mason's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a different message from the unknown number. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. Betrayal runs deeper than you know. Mason felt a chill race down his spine. The echoes of the past had returned, reminding him that some shadows would always linger, and the fight for trust and love was a battle that never truly ended.